All right, so the movie that we went and saw this week, and more specifically, the movie that Bridget went and saw this week, is The Exorcist Believer. Okay, so The Exorcist Believer is a movie that Universal Studios and Blumhouse are already like a $500 million in the hole for. They spent an eye-watering $400 million to acquire the franchise rights, and then they spent like 30 million, which seems like chumps change in comparison, to
Right.
make the movie. And I'm sure then there's probably spent like another 10 or 15 million, let's say, marketing the movie on what they call promotions and advertising. So P&A, which kind of, if you round that number up a little bit, I mean, yeah, it's like 450, 500, million dollars. They're basically $1 billion in on this movie. Now it's got a pretty decent opening weekend. If you just go by its budget of 30 million, it's expected to kind of debut with around $28 million at the domestic box office. You add in some of the international numbers, it's looking like it will probably make back at least its budget, but it does not look like it's making back nearly enough to justify the amount of money they spent on just getting the rights to the franchise. Not to mention, it's got like a C cinema score, I think, like a C or C minus cinema score.
Mhm.
And it's got like, at the last I checked, it was in the 20s, like the critic score. And even worse, in my opinion, the audience score was in the 50s. So when you look at the cinema score, which is basically, audiences coming out of theaters getting interviewed, did you like the movie? And they gave it a C. That's not very good. Anything below like a B is usually pretty bad. It's much like if you got a C on a paper, that's not good. So, Bridget, you went and saw this movie. Clearly, it's not impressing a lot of the fans. I mean, for a franchise that is iconic as horror gets, The Exorcist, if you haven't seen one of those in many, many years, of course, the movie came out a week sooner because Taylor Swift, wanted Friday the 13th all to herself. I mean, she didn't say that specifically, but, Jason Blum was like, we'll let you have that one. We will move a week forward. And they did. But what did you think about this movie? You of course went and saw it. What was your opinion on this? Are you a big horror fan? Like, I just want to get your opinion on The Exorcist, the Believer.
Sure.
The Exorcist Believer, not the Believer. Sorry.
Yeah. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with horror movies in general. Like, I actually do. I love, especially when the story is kind of like a mystery, and I'm always drawn to that. But I'm such a baby, and I can't even go to like Universal horror nights or anything like that. I'm a jumps. Anything makes me jump. So jump scares always get me.
Yeah.
Which there were quite a few in this movie. Um, when it started out, the whole premise and the story, I felt good about it. I was, of course, some parts like looking for my fingers, but
Yeah.
I did just watch most of the movie, and um, I was also reading some of the critics' reviews as well, and I do kind of agree that it did feel like it was kind of missing some of the, I don't know, that kind of feeling that you had watching the first one, the first Exorcist movie, a classic. There's just something about that one that even after watching it, you go home and you still feel like a little unnerved. Um, this, had a lot to live up to being a predecessor of that movie, and I definitely think they were trying their best. But even some of the special effects and the makeup, it's even for me who gets scared easily, it still felt like it could have been a bit scarier. And so I feel like if you are a really diehard horror fan and that's what you're there for, you might feel a bit disappointed, I would think, in just like kind of leaving feeling spooked. Um, but yeah, and also just personally, the ending was, I don't know, it just didn't like tie it up for me, the whole story.
Yeah. It's similar. I mean, I think that's basically very similar to what a lot of critics are thinking about. Now, of course, you mentioned that for you, jump scares are, something that you you don't take kindly to, which I am not a fan of the horror genre, partly because I don't like the idea of just movies relying on jump scares alone to scare you
Right.
into like a horror narrative, let's say. I much rather I'm not, I shouldn't say I'm not a fan of the horror genre. I just think the majority of the horror movies out there, I think these days are too gimmicky in that sense. They either rely on gore They rely on like the satanic elements or just jump scares. Jump scares, I think, is probably the cheapest thing that they do. I'm like a good jump scare every once in a while, well placed, well timed, is a good tool to have in your tool belt for as a horror filmmaker. Like David Gordon Green. Did I get it right? He's got like three first names. Yeah, David Gordon Green. Yeah, he made this movie. He's of course directed the new Halloween movies, the trilogy, which to mixed results, and it looks like a lot of the critics are saying, yeah, this is not nearly as good as the original. It doesn't quite have that uniqueness. And although you might be thinking 50 years ago, horror movies probably hit different. There was a lot fewer horror franchises that were so iconic, and at this point, like we've been there and done that so many times. I mean, there was a movie called The Pope's Exorcist that came out earlier this year with
Mhm.
Russell Crowe, where the logo looked very much like it was paying homage to The Exorcist. I don't know if it's in any way whatsoever connected to the Exorcist franchise, the new iteration of the franchise, I suppose. But that movie like had its moments where it was like, yeah, it's Russell Crowe, so like we gotta make him look cool. So like it seemed like that movie wasn't taking itself super seriously all the time, or when it had some of its more over the top moments, it was sort of just like going with the flow. Whereas in this movie, it seems like from what you're describing, they do a lot of world building. They kind of take themselves seriously. This is very much like meant to feel like The Exorcist as close to the original as possible. As at least that was the intention. But
Right.
if you go by your opinion as well as that of a lot of the critics and a lot of the fans, it's not really living up to the billing. It's according to one review that I read from Vox, it was like as a film, it's at best serviceable, which is basically in my mind translates to mediocre. So like that's not a very good sign. And when I mentioned earlier that this movie is set to come, make around 28, 30 million in its opening weekend, which is basically its budget. And that's domestic, so I'm sure it's going to make a little more internationally, and that's probably going to add up to a good number. But the fact that it's got like a C minus cinema score, like a 23% critic score, and then of course a 56, I think the last time I checked was an audience score, which is a number that usually when you start adding more reviews, those numbers tend to go down, not up. It's rare that you see the number climb up. And to be quite frank, at 56, it's going to need to do a lot of climbing up before it's not looking like that spilt,
Right.
bag bucket of popcorn symbol on Rotten Tomatoes. So
Yeah. And I
all of
think
that to say,
like
none of
having
these are good signs for like the second weekend. And like I would be concerned about like the legs on this movie. Like, is it gonna do well enough? Like it may not even, I mean, making back your budget is not enough to be profitable. You need to usually like double that
that.
or close to it, like or to actually be profitable. So what do you think? Like, is this thing gonna do well enough to like be worth, I mean, certainly not the 400 million that Universal spent on it, although I bet you they're probably going to amortize that cost across multiple movies in the franchise.
Right.
But do you think it's going to make enough money to even warrant a sequel? Like, will Universal just bury
Right.
this after?
That's the question. And it is hard because it's like you kind of need the first one to really have some momentum just to get people back in the seats. If they remember it as like, that was, I enjoyed it. I'm going to see the second one. So if people already feel like, you had your shot. It's been 10 years. This was the one. Why should I go see the second? So I think now it's difficult. They've kind of got that against them. And then, too, I think even like that psychological factor, I think is important too. Like having it open on Friday the 13th. I feel like for a lot of
Yeah.
people that are really into like, the Halloween season, that would have been perfect. I feel like that would have drawn a lot more people in. Like, hey, what are
Yeah.
your plans for Friday the 13th in October? Gonna go see a horror movie. Like that would have been, I think, really the ultimatum too for a lot of people to be drawn to see it. And so fortunately, because of Taylor, they kind of that's working a lot against them too, I think.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, if not for nothing else, Friday the 13th, I mean, of course, the date itself is iconic for the horror genre, but also you're 1 week closer to Halloween. And, a lot more people are shopping for Halloween costumes and being,
Activities.
just in that festive fall season. It's something that right now it just feels like we just started October and we're still sort of in that phase is like Halloween's not even here yet. Why am I seeing Halloween costumes everywhere phase of the year? But like a week from now, particularly with Friday the 13th, being a thing this year in October, that would have been, yeah. I mean, I think that definitely didn't help it. And the fact that we've got this, huge train that's gonna like roll over any and all competition next week called Taylor Swift.
Hmm.
I doubt that a lot of the people who went and saw it this week are going to be going to see it next week, particularly because that Taylor Swift Eras Tour film is becoming one of those cultural zeitgeist cooler talk moments. Like, if you didn't watch that episode of Game of Thrones, you can't be talking about it. Like, or if you didn't go and watch the Taylor Swift movie or didn't go and
You
watch that
missed
Avengers
April,
movie,
basically.
you're going to be left out of a lot of conversations. So yeah, I feel like a lot of the people who went and saw it this week, like they might get their repeat viewings during the week or they might not. Like it's, we're not no longer in the summer vacation time. People are back to work, back to school. So you don't quite have those advantages. And so it's probably not going to do a lot of business during the week. And next weekend doesn't look like there's a lot of people who, I mean, good counter programming, maybe, but there's also other competition, other movies that are still in theaters. I think I'd like to think that A Haunting in Venice, even though it wasn't entirely great itself, or even The Expendables 4, which is a pretty bad movie, but both of them are relatively entertaining. So like, you can still go watch those.
Right,
So there's options like The Nun 2 is still playing, like which
right.
is
Which is
already, made a decent amount and very much in the same, vein of things, if you will, even the same subgenre of horror, if you want to say that. So, guys, let us know in the comments below, what did you think about The Exorcist Believer? Of course, if you're watching this review, then you may have already seen the movie. If you haven't seen the movie and you still plan on going to see it, tell us why. Because all the signs from other fans and critics seem to indicate that it's not worth a watch, or it's certainly underwhelming for a lot of people's expectations. But let us know what you thought or what you think about the movie in the comments below. Like and subscribe for more content like this. Maybe reviewing movies like this every week as we do on Also Curious for the Love of Movies.